Well, Professor Cooper, don't you know she's one take Wolf?
Oh, she's got no choice now. And by the way, you're now a part of her video.
All right. Okay. In the 1970s, my grandmother came out as a lesbian. She had a husband, 3 daughters, and a very young son. This was the 70s, so there was no framework for what came next. Up until this moment in her life, she had had a framework, a set of expectations of what life she'd live. She was born in England and after high school left home to work on a kibbutz in Israel. There she met a young guy from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, married him, and moved back to the States with him to start a family. 4 kids later, she had a family, and though they struggled financially and lived a harder life than she might have pictured for herself, she was on the path that had been laid out for her. And then she came out as lesbian, a huge crash in the framework that her life had expected. Her husband, my grandfather, was furious, hurt, bitter. He moved out of their small house into an even smaller apartment down the road. Her children were grieving the loss of their father's presence and the lives they thought they'd grow up with. And there she was, for the first time in her life, the driver of her own narrative. And this question now was only hers to decide. What would she do next? With no income, in a country without her parents, siblings, and friends, who would she be now that the framework of what was expected of her fell away? And how would her choices affect her children? What precedents would they set for her daughters? My grandma went to school. She got an undergraduate degree and then a master's and then her PhD. She became politically active, attending meetings, protests, and actions for radical feminist groups and gay and lesbian organizations. She met partners, friends, and colleagues, and eventually she became a queer theory professor at the University of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. As a child, I heard bits and pieces of my grandma Cheryl's story. Early on, me and my sister knew this story was a part of our family history. At my Jewish day school, we learned about how every Jewish family is a part of the greater Jewish story, going back all the way to the first families, our patriarchs and matriarchs, our Abahot and Imahot. And it wasn't hard to see their strength and qualities reflected in the families, mothers, and grandmothers I knew in my own life. But as I've grown older, it's felt harder and harder to reconcile what I'd felt about our matriarchs as a young girl with what our texts have to say about femininity and them. Week after week, we read parshaot and commentary that erase, overlook, villainize, objectify, and sexualize women, our imahot. And every time I read another example of this, I cannot help but think about my childhood. On Friday nights, with the soft glow of the candles and the smell of my mom's sweet perfume as she placed her hands on my head, whispering, "May you be like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah." This last week's Parshat Vayetze, we met Leah. And I've always been unsure of how to overcome this feeling that Leah is the weaker of the 4. Compared to Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel, she's an outlier. We're taught to see Leah as the antithesis to Rachel. Rachel is beautiful, so Leah is not. Rachel is wanted, so Leah is not. Leah is the foil to Rachel's beauty and charisma and all that draws Jacob to her. Growing up, I even saw Leah as getting in the way of the storyline I wanted to happen, Jacob and Rachel's story. I instantly cared for their relationship when Jacob kisses Rachel and bursts into tears. Jacob's tears were a sign of how they were destined to be together. And Leah, she's described as plain, sad, envious, and more often she's not described. She's not seen as an active part of the story. She's an afterthought, an interruption, a delay in getting the marriage and storyline that I expected and wanted. I wasn't sure what of Leah I was meant to be like when on Friday nights my mom would whisper her blessing to me. May you be like Leah. What traits was my mom hoping Leah would pass to me? All I could think about were her weak eyes, her sadness, her lack of action. There's a midrash from Rashi commenting on Genesis 28:17 that says Leah knew her sister Rachel's destiny was to marry Jacob. Rashi says that Leah, while standing at a crosswalk, overhears 2 people saying, "Rebecca has 2 sons, Lavan has 2 daughters. The elder daughter should marry the eldest son, and the younger daughter should marry the younger son. Leah, overhearing this, asks, "What's the older son like?" And the people reply, "Oh, he is a wicked man, a robber and a thief." And Leah, concerned, asks, "And the younger brother, what's he like?" And they respond, "He's a simple man who dwells in tents." Frozen in this crosswalk, after hearing the framework of how her life would unfold, Leah cries and cries. She cries so much her eyes are permanently red and irritated and foggy. She cries so much that her eyelashes fall off, which give her eyes this unique appearance of, at the same time, never fully closing, while also being closed by redness and irritation. In the Tanakh, Leah has no verbs attributed to her and no action until Genesis 29:32. And Leah conceived and gave birth. The Midrash from Rashi can be read as Leah's tears in some way being self-destructive. Through the action of crying and crying, she renders her eyes dull and unusual. But a feminist reading can see these tears as an act of defiance, a protest against her destiny. Leah is rejecting the life laid out for her, the life of marrying Esav, a life of having no say in who she is given to. The brilliant Torah scholar Aviva Gottlieb Zorenberg sees Leah's tears as so deep a protest that she is willing to undo herself, to efface herself, to not be Leah. Her permanently reddened, blurry eyes making her face a kind of tragic mask, Zorenberg says. A woman undoing her beauty, masking her physical appearance in protest is powerful. Leah perhaps has much more action in her story than I grew up being taught. And in the Torah text, time and time again, Leah is the object of an action and not the subject taking action. The text, during the wedding scene, attributes all of the verbs to Lavan. When evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to him. Genesis 29:23. Leah is absent in the action. She is taken and given. But when I think of her tears of defiance, I think that someone so adamant in undoing her destiny might actually be playing more of an active role in the making of this marriage than what appears in the Pshat. Another midrash in Tanhum Vayetze, this one from Jacob and Leah's wedding night, imagines the moment that Jacob is in bed with his new wife. He calls out Rachel's name, and Leah responds to that name. In the morning, Jacob is horrified and sees, behold, it was Leah, and confronts her. He shouts at her, "You are a deceiver and the daughter of a deceiver." And Leah, in response, says, "Is there a teacher without a pupil? Didn't your father call Esav and you responded? You called Rachel and I responded." Jacob chastises Leah and her father for lying and deceiving him, for pretending to be Rachel. But Leah reminds him how he lied and deceived his own father by pretending to be Esav. Far from the meek and sniffling woman Leah is perceived to be, here she is strong and sure of herself. In the face of her new husband, she reminds Jacob that deception is sometimes necessary in order to live the life that you see for yourself, and that he, more than anyone, should know this. In this version of Leah and Jacob's wedding, Leah is not only an active participant, but the plotter of the action. She seeks out Jacob, emboldened by the knowledge that he'd done the same in seeking out the birthright only a little while before. But in Leah's deceiving of Jacob, I wonder where Rachel was, what she was doing, thinking and feeling while her sister pretended to be her. We're used to hearing about some kind of sisterly competition between the two, or imagining this as a scene from The Bachelor with two women fighting over a man. But Rashi brings a midrash from Megillah 13b on Rachel's role in the wedding plot. Rashi says that prior to the wedding, Jacob gave Rachel signals and cues for how they could at all times recognize one another. Rashi says that on the night of the wedding, Rachel sees that Leah is preparing to wed Jacob, and Rachel worries that her sister will be shamed at the altar if the lie is discovered. And so she tells Leah of the signs and cues that she and Jacob had planned. Growing up, I always assumed that Rachel loved Jacob, and that more than anything, Rachel wanted to marry Jacob and to be his wife. This midrash about Rachel's signals is a beautiful reminder that we do not know in almost any moment of the Torah what the female character's thoughts and desires are. Perhaps Leah did love Jacob. Perhaps Rachel did love Jacob, but her love for her sister Leah was stronger than her desire to marry Jacob. Perhaps she didn't love Jacob, and she was comfortable letting her sister take over her destiny as the role of being Jacob's wife. Perhaps Leah and Rachel are the true love story at play, sisters who support one another and honor each other even at the potential sacrifice of their own. Perhaps, maybe, May You Be Like Rachel and Leah is a reminder of both the strength as well as the love and support that allow Leah to usurp her destiny and take control of her own narrative. The fact that we don't know why Rachel and Leah in this moment, the fact that we don't know why Rachel helps Leah in this moment reminds me that the stories in the Torah were written by men. The very character of Leah reminds me that these stories were written by men. These midrashic stories by medieval commentators are written by men. Our tradition as a whole has been written by men. But what can we do about it when blatant and heartbreaking sexism exists in every corner of our beautiful tradition? I think as a start, we need to tell the stories of Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah through the lens of the stories of the matriarchs that we have in our own lives. Because Leah's story feels a lot more like my grandma Cheryl's, a lot more real and alive when I investigate it more fully. And when I disregard the biases and patriarchy that have rendered Leah's story anything but alive, rich, and real. We need more commentary that holds up the voices of women. We shouldn't be going a full semester in any course, regardless of the topic, without reading a woman's or a non-cis male's source or writings. We need to continue to be uncomfortable with the erasure, the violence, the sexualization, villainization, and disregard of women happening in our written tradition. And we need to call attention to that uncomfortability. Overlooking it or not calling it out only gives more weight and power to this patriarchal narrative. When we don't call attention to these wrongs in our tradition, we can become desensitized to it. It becomes a part of the status quo. We owe it to the women and to the trans and non-binary folks and the non-cis men in our tradition to enter into this uncomfortable space more often, this space of examining and challenging the minimizing and oversimplifying of women's narratives. When I think back to the child's blessing, may you be like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. I imagine Sarah reaching out to bless Rebecca, and Rebecca offering her own blessings to Rachel and Leah, hands held over them. I see Leah and Rachel continuing the blessings, arms outstretched for the millions and millions of women who have come from their families. I imagine my grandma's hands on my mother, offering her blessings, and my mother passing them through me, each generation adding their own hopes and wishes for the next. I think of the long chain of women who have reached out to bless us, offering their hopes and wishes for the future that for many of them felt so out of reach. And when I think, please God, of one day placing my hands on my future daughters' heads, I'll bless them knowing that the imahot who have come before them are with me, offering their blessings all over again. May you be like Leah, strong and powerful. May you take control of your narrative and be the writer of your story.